Welcome to Clothing Culture, a fashion industry podcast at the intersection of technology and innovation. I'm Emily Lane.
And I'm Bret Schnitker. We speak with experts and disruptors who are moving the industry forward
And discuss solutions to real industry challenges.
Clothing Culture is brought to you by Stars Design Group, a global design and production house with more than 30 years of experience.
Welcome back to another episode of Clothing Culture. Today, we are coming to you from the beautiful Hollywood Hills in Laurel Canyon. Feels really wonderful to be here, doesn't it, Bret?
It does. It feels great.
Yeah, so we have a pretty exciting conversation lined up, but we've been talking about a lot of massive shifts that we've been experiencing in the fashion industry. We've had the rise of e-commerce, looking at last year, $469 billion in sales in this industry. And really looking at 2022, the expectation is that it's going to cross 1 trillion. We've had, since the pandemic, athleisure increase about 84%. And, things like the Metaverse has come into almost a daily conversation. Brick and
Makes
mortar.
sense. I'm in my pajamas below at the table.
And we look amazing digitally, don't
yeah.
we? And then, of course, the challenges with brick and mortar. And so, knowing that we really want to talk about these macro trends that are hitting the industry, we reached out to some of our close friends to find out who the expert is that we wanted to have this conversation with. Our good friend Keenan Dufty really brought a wonderful resource to the table. We are joined by Paul Raffin. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much. Excited to be here.
So, Bret, why don't you share with our listeners a little bit about this amazing career of this resource that we have at our table?
I'm amazed. Coming from retail myself many years ago, I kind of departed and started Stars after that. But I look at your history and the wealth of information that you must have gained being CEO and president of all these kind of legendary organizations and the diversity, J. Crew, Lian Feng sourcing organization.
Express,
Fret Linen.
One of your favorites, Barbados.
Yeah, love Barbados. Always love Barbados. People have always politely said, I've been in the business tens of years. You've shared a similar trajectory over that many years. And I think being at the helm of all these different organizations and looking at, kind of how we did business years ago and then what's happening today to change all those dynamics, it must be an interesting time.
It really is. It's a very exciting time in the fashion industry. There is a certain, the emperor has no clothes aspect, especially post-pandemically now, because brands and companies who were not future thinking and progressive enough to invest in their digital agenda or truly understanding what consumer engagement requires, which means being agile, understanding customers generally move faster than brands do, they may be left in the dust. And some of the tried and true methodologies that I employed, that I was taught by great mentors like the late Marvin Traub, the progenitor of the experiential retail model, retail as theater. He was an amazing man, way ahead of his times. Certainly Les Wexner, Victor and William Fung, as you mentioned, phenomenal people, even working with John Varvatos, a good friend and associate of mine. The common denominator there is really pattern recognition, and not just the internal patterns of your business, which can tend to be an overused strength because you can see it, it's empirical, it's non-debatable. We sold 100,000 units of this particular product last year. Let's do it again next year. It's much more important now to weight that pattern recognition exercise to the consumer and truly understanding where the consumer demand is moving, what the lifestyle changes our culture is posing to them, because brands that don't do that are going to find themselves in the dustbin of irrelevance. And I think we're going to see more and more of that happen, but there's an exciting changing of the guard where some new brands now are cropping up to take that new mantle on.
What a big shift, because I remember being in retail and obviously the groups that you worked with, we kind of dictated fashion for our consumer. We would say, here's our styling. We're saying that this is hot, go buy it and drive that. And, I'd say maybe 5-6 years ago, the whole conversation about consumer-driven economy became pretty evident in the market, and it continues to gain a lot of momentum. And I think for that traditional retail model, it creates a lot of complexity, especially when, we apply these dated, I guess, thinking when we set up planning, open to buys, things like that, because we would always look in the rearview mirror.
That's right. And again, the dirty little secret is that most apparel manufacturers and brands plan off an Excel spreadsheet, and they have difficulty finding sales attribution and forecasting sales attribution because you don't know, is it coming from an influencer? Is it coming from e-commerce? Is it coming from my brick and mortar store windows? Where is demand coming from? And I think the guessing wrong, that mismatch in a $350 billion fashion apparel industry is generally estimated to be about $100 billion a year, where it's the wrong product, the wrong quantity, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Of course, that's fueled the off-price industry, whether it's outlet stores or TJ Maxx. The waste involved in that is now really the center of attention, especially with sustainability becoming such an important topic. But more importantly, it's really understanding what does the consumer really look for from a brand. And it's not just the things we wear, it's the values that that brand represents. And I think the old-fashioned methodologies that you and I are both familiar with, Bret, created a lot of obsolete inventory because we, again, just forecast incorrectly. We were seduced by the initial margin of producing products in mainland China, in Vietnam, and India, et cetera. But we never really focused as much because it wasn't on our cost sheet, the cost of the markdowns.
That's right. I remember the first thing I was told as a buyer tens of years ago, many tens of years ago, is you either overbuy or underbuy, you never buy the right amount. Yeah. Never think you can buy the right amount. And it was always this kind of law of odds. You were a great buyer if you did more right than wrong. And then, that resultant inventory that you mentioned, I mean, even today is compounded pretty dramatically by the rising costs. Overall, we're seeing about a 7% increase in quote transient inflation. But when you break all these things up into individual categories, our industry is hit pretty heavy at about 17.5% increase. We got rising,
logistics,
raw materials costs, labor costs, logistics are out of sight. So I think, that it's very interesting, that unknown component of managing that residual inventory that just wipes out a lot of profitability.
Yeah, it does. And then you've got the perception of value from the way the consumer looks at a brand. And I've always been a big believer in the benefits ladder, technical, functional, ultimately emotional. Emotional benefits is really where that intangible value is that a consumer is willing to pay up. You see a lot of luxury purveyors now, like Chanel, Louis Vuitton, increasing prices significantly because of supply chain disruption, raw material costs going up, labor costs, et cetera, and they're tacking on 25% increases because they've got the pricing power.
And their consumer is okay with that.
Yeah, because emotionally to them, my God, a new Chanel bag, it's a reflection of their own life and their lifestyle.
But that's like a fraction of the 1%. What happens with the rest of the people? And then you throw in the Gen Z mentality about the importance of sustainability in all those conversations. How do you think, brands large or small today kind of manage all of those challenges?
Well, I think, listen, certainly Chanel's an extreme. You're going to see a culling of the herd, as it were, with respect to all the mediocre product that's fodder, as it were, for the system. It's Forever 21, it's pretty much gone. And even H&M is trying to reboot. My experience at Express with fast fashion, where you would stack it high, let it fly on a promotional formula. It was already built in. We knew we were never going to sell a lot of it at full price. All that's, I think, going to the side. And people are really trying to put in position products that approach a customer's true desire to engage with that brand, things that they'd be proud to wear. I do think less is more, and it's always been, we'd look to Europe and say, it's a European mentality. Buy a few very good things as opposed to just a closet full. And that closet full of stuff that people really don't wear that often gave rise to Rent the Runway and other models because they're recognizing the fact that the old rules no longer apply.
With America being the consumer nation that it is, do you think the less is more model will take hold?
I do, because I think apparel, as important as it is as an expression of your own personal creativity and kind of a communication device, has faded in its relative importance versus experiences. And of course, everyone's talked about that. But if you have X amount of discretionary income, and remember, listen, I came from a day in the 70s when Bloomingdale's on a Saturday afternoon was a place to go as if it were a singles bar. I mean, that's where everyone went.
Right.
No one does that in department stores anymore, certainly. No. And with the advent of e-commerce, it's so easy to facilitate your shopping experience without having to go into a store. So,
especially with
people
AI.
talk about omni-channel today. Isn't that kind of a dated term? Hasn't it completely kind of evolved from that original concept?
Yeah, I think omnichannel is antiquated because between e-commerce, social media, brick and mortar, the metaverse, which will ultimately represent a fusion of the physical and virtual worlds, it's just commerce. And it used to be you'd have a division that would handle your e-commerce business, a division that would handle your brick and mortar, and they were separate and they were kind of their own pillars. Now it's all together. However, what's interesting is that you've got Saks.
That's exactly
and
what
now
I was
Macy's,
going to say. Yeah.
Which I think is a financial play to unlock value for their investors versus when they separate e-commerce from brick and mortar retail stores. Does the consumer benefit from that? The consumer's looking for a seamless experience.
Yeah.
I think it's yet to be seen whether Saks can successfully pull that off.
Is this kind of a play to say, hey, look, we're going to be winding down our brick and mortar and, hoping that the e-commerce picks up enough volume and traction? They've got so much money invested in real estate, and
yeah, they're unlocking the real estate value, frankly.
Yeah.
And whether it's sell the real estate, lease it back for the physical locations that they want to maintain.
Yeah.
But I think I heard, maybe correct, there are something like 250 different services agreements between those two entities and Saks. I mean,
seems confusing.
It's so confusing as to how two organizations can, again, to the ultimate consumer, pose one, because they don't care about the fiscal division of those entities. They just want to be serviced.
Yeah.
And, if you walk into a Saks Fifth Avenue store and they don't have what you're looking for, does that salesperson then seamlessly transition you into their e-commerce platform and maintain the sale?
With us and the advent of Amazon ease of experience, you would think every other retailer should be kind of trying to follow that model where, if it's not available on store, it's immediately shipped to you overnight or whatever. And it seems the disconnect seems somewhat interesting.
And that's part of the cost formula that is really expensive, is figuring out that the services that Amazon has treated us all to, that are now the expected standard, to apply those to a department store, or even worse, a brand that's traditionally been doing wholesale business and now wants to set up more of a direct-to-consumer effort. The capital expense and investment necessary there is really huge.
And the infrastructure. I mean, Amazon has built their own fleets, basically. We saw this last holiday, FedEx, UPS, massive surcharges in the ability to deliver, long delivery delays that have never been experienced before because of this massive increase in e-commerce, people sick, frankly, with COVID, not many workers on the road, all these issues compounding are really putting some headwinds into the move toward, e-commerce outside of Amazon. I mean, Amazon's an interesting position because they've just, the foresight in, hey, we're building our own kind of, entire fleets and not relying on the typical small parcel carrier that, is really experiencing some explosive growth.
And for brands, strong brands, it's a cultural change too, to go from, take a Nike, for instance, who now has I want to say 65 to 70% of their business is now direct to consumer. They've really started to pull back on their wholesale channel of distribution because they find it's not the most potent way of engaging the customer in the Nike brand. But the cultural change that has to take place in order to really understand the responsibility you have to sell the customer on a direct basis versus delivering 500,000 units to Macy's distribution center, that requires a completely different operation inside the company itself.
Yeah, especially the expectations of people on the receiving end.
Yes.
So when we talk about the evolution of the physical store, because we've been mentioning Saks, we've mentioning all these people, what do you think this is going to look like in the future? You talk about experiential retail. Everyone is talking about how to recreate shopping malls to be experiential. Customers want to go in and have a good time, and by the way, pick up some items. What are you seeing happening?
It's been interesting. I just took note that Rebecca Minkoff's company was just sold, not for very much money, but they had some difficulty coming through the pandemic. And they were one of the small companies who were at allegedly the leading edge of technology in the retail selling environment, the physical environment, whether it was a smart fitting room, et cetera. Yep. I also remember seeing what Burberry did in London. I went right after they opened and was fascinated by their smart fitting rooms where you could push a screen. All of that, hang the technology on the wall to dazzle the customer and make us look like we are a very progressive brand, I think is going by the wayside. I think technology should be there in a much more subtle way, subliminally to serve the customer and serve the environment transactionally, but not overwhelm it. So when people ask me, what's the most experiential retail store you've seen, I keep coming back to Italy. I used to live in Flatiron before I moved here. Luckily, I'm here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, talk about a transition.
Yeah, but the Flatiron Italy box is a fascinating exercise in what I call food wrapped in socialization, because their conversion rate must be 90% plus. I defy anyone to go into that store and not participate in buying something. But you see, young, old, whatever target audience, they put their phones down, they have a really beautiful meal over a glass of Brunello di Montalcino and socialize with each other, that human aspect and that connection, and then are able to take a piece of that experience home with them with some of the best curated Italian products in the world. So I think that's an analog for how, certainly Nike has attempted to do some of that in their stores.
Not with Brunello, though. Unfortunately, I'd be buying a lot more Nike.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it definitely makes sense. We're especially, coming out of the pandemic, where we didn't get a chance to have human connection. And so now we're in this place where the experience means so much more. So I see there being a very specific need for in-store to have it be very experiential. We've spent a lot of time behind computers over the last couple of years. So digitized interior space, I think, can compromise that personal touch. However, online, that's where I think your technology can really play a key role. AI creating a customized experience for
that's right, Emily, and that CRM, it can't be a one-size-fits-all proposition. And we've all been, subject to just email blasts coming from every brand we, visit. Frankly, where everyone's being retargeted. But that individual CRM message, because they know your purchase pattern, they know what you like, and they tailor it for you with the use of technology. So you're right. It's kind of an interesting contrast.
Absolutely. Yeah, I get how many emails? 300 junk emails each day from brands I've shopped at in the past. And, you just delete most of them. So really making sure that message is tailored to the individual customer can really...
Lululemon's a brand that's done the experiential store format really, really well because they've invented a community. They have access to community who really is loyal, and the pre-store opening yoga classes that they give, and of course their product. It does the technical functional emotional ladder really, really well. It's, other than that one little yoga pant mishap they
Right.
had,
Yeah.
they recovered from that. And now you're seeing so many of the competitors attempting Alo, Athleta, they're all nipping at their heels trying to get the market share.
I would say every brand, we talk a lot about technology and fashion on this podcast. And, you look at Lululemon and some of the successes, this kind of community kind of approach, yoga, classes, things like that. But at the same time, them buying Mirror, actually purchasing Mirror Company because that's the technology so people can launch it at home. I've got that at home. I think I've used it 3 times, sadly, but it's an amazing program.
That's a Peloton-like headline.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think everywhere there's this whole conversation about, how to incorporate technology without it really working against you. You mentioned those kind of in-store, smart mirrors where people could put things on. We were having a conversation with Sharon Lim at Browseware, and we've been doing 3D design for many, many years. And one of the evolutions within Browseware was this kind of like smart mirror technology. You can stand in front and it would drape the garment on. And in focus groups that they had, it worked kind of shockingly in reverse. They actually saw themselves exactly as it would in bright light, and it was reversing the sales because, we kind of, when we're in a dimly lit fitting room, you tend to think, and the music's going and all this. And when people are actually sitting in front of some of these things and just seeing the stark reality of their body type, they're actually seeing kind of some more negative results.
Well, you can talk yourself into, if you like the fabric, if it feels good, you can kind of talk yourself into it, even if you think maybe it's not the best. Like you're like, oh, I'll take the garment home and then decide, or if you see it purely digitally and you're seeing this image that you're like, ooh.
So how do you create something
that.
that's kind of sexy, makes you look good, but also, provides the accurate information for, fit decisions as we move more online? I guess statistics are somewhere between 20 and 40% exchanges and returns, which is an outrageous expense.
It's a huge expense. That net to gross factor is punishing because listen, technology can aid with respect to speed and accuracy. This industry, especially fashion apparel, is antiquated. It's way too slow. Why does it take 6 to 8 months to make a sweater? It really doesn't, but that's the way the industry...
No, it just takes 6 to 8 months to ship the sweater
and get it here. And then you have to deal with a factory in China who likes to have their sales pipeline full. They don't want to be scrambling for business. The automobile industry did a just-in-time manufacturing led by Toyota and the Japanese manufacturers many, many years ago, at least 2 decades ago. Apparel is really slow to follow that. And I think technology is going to aid the better forecasting, the digitalization of the entire supply chain from concept through manufacturing and forecasting, assortment optimization, inventory management, all the way to the store environment, knowing how stores should be configured and assorted in specific markets, all the way to the CRM, campaigns that will individually address specific consumers. That whole breadth of activity is a major beneficiary of the technological revolution that we're all witnessing. It's just that it's expensive. And you've got to have a very specific IT agenda in order to know how to pull that off.
Well, and you've got to have a lot of people components signing on to that. Where we agree with that, where Stars is part of a beta team of a company out of Silicon Valley called Silk. And it is that full transparent supply chain from beginning to end. And just pulling all of those components together, it's going to be an interesting couple of years trying to get that going.
Well, because data scientists now are being hired by smart apparel brands because they recognize, in the past, that pattern recognition exercise that we would seek to do with study the consumer, study your competition, study your own internal patterns, try to put it into a big bowl and create some sort of a position you want to take regarding the brand, the product you're going to bring forward to the marketplace. Now there's so much more data available that's coming into that funnel. So what should you regard versus what should you not regard at all. And trying to sort through that, I think the merchant's role has got to be augmented by the data analysis that, frankly, they need some support in doing. So smart companies are bringing in that type of assistance and support.
So when you look at, all this experience, all these changes in the marketplace, and kind of your evolution, you're now kind of giving back. You're working with small startup companies using all this experience. What are you seeing happening out there with some startups that are exciting?
Well, it's definitely embracing the technology aspect and understanding that there are new ways of bringing product to the market. And it's funny, the whole mass-produced aspect, that apparel, that bloom is off the rose with the Forever 21s and the H&Ms and the big box, just jam a lot of inventory, that old push model, is giving way to things that are, I don't want to say artisan, because there is that as well, but that's at the upper end.
We kind of call it the rise of the boutique brand industry.
Yeah,
really.
and a little more boutique.
Guys with niches,
Yeah, I
visions.
mean, my fear for the industry is that, listen, because the culture right now is having important conversations as far as gender fluidity, inclusivity, body type, et cetera, I see a lot of brands attempting to be involved in that conversation on a very broad basis. The risk they have is that you can diffuse and dilute your overall image and what you represent to. So it's interesting to me, and again, I know it's a very controversial topic, but you don't see plus size models walking down a Chanel runway. However, on a more democratic brand like Victoria's Secret, who was taken out to the woodshed and their zeitgeist was clearly declared to be over, they've been forced to reboot to include the body, the body consciousness aspect, the gender aspect. They had their first transgender model that's part of their new marketing campaign. And I just would caution brands that if you're trying to be everything to everyone, you're really nothing at the end of the day. That doesn't mean you should be disrespectful to the subsets of people who are bringing this consciousness raising to the cultural conversation. But I just find it interesting, again, how some brands are being really pilloried in the arena of social media when they don't do that, and other brands are kind of riding above it without that type of critique.
It's a complex landscape with all those conversations going on. And I think, startup brands, especially younger startup brands, they really do want to address a lot of these social conversations that are going on. In addressing each one of those conversations, to your point, there's an expense to that. There is there's a SKU creep, there's a size creep, and understanding who your consumer is that's coming to you is really critical. That's where that whole consumer-driven conversation is important. Is that particular consumer coming to your brand? Therefore, if that's got a good ROI, if there's a good engagement from a community level, then it's a good decision. But if it's not, looking at your DNA and who your consumer base is critical.
Staying true to your DNA.
And Universal Standard is probably the poster child for that type of an approach, where they're offering a woman from 00 to size 40. And so the size 6 consumer who participates in that brand clearly loves and attaches herself to the values that brand stands for as a result of that inclusivity. And I think back to your question about startups and these Gen Z millennials who are leading them, because I've probably worked with 25, 30 of them at this point. The hey boomer aspect of that is real. I think, unfortunately, boardrooms and executive committee suites are populated by a lot of boomers who are still hanging on to the old push model and the old, no, this is the way we've always done it. And I'm sure these conversations go on inside even Ralph Lauren, who's had to, you talk about master of a theme,
of course,
had to evolve rather quickly before losing relevance. But I think Gen Z and millennials will prove to be a class of consumers who truly hold values as being as important, if not more so, than the quality of the product that they're wearing.
I think that's actually a really beautiful transition in the industry.
I agree.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and your years of experience, your tens of years of experience with us today. And
Decades, yes.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, make sure to subscribe to stay apprised of upcoming episodes of Clothing Culture.